The author suggests that research interviews are a systematic form of audience analysis. In this applied context, one can group quantitative research interviews into two categories. The first category includes public opinion surveys, while the second category includes convenience and intercept surveys. Public opinion surveys can sometimes be confused with polls. Technically, a survey is a longer questionnaire that seeks more in-depth information, while a poll uses a shorter questionnaire with relatively simple questions to seek descriptive information. Both surveys and polls are cross-sectional research, which means that the sample of the study draws from a cross-section of the studied population. When researchers develop questionnaires for political polls, they will often work with their clients to determine which questions will be most useful to elicit relevant voter information to inform campaign decisions. When researchers work on surveys, they will typically consider previous research to develop in-depth questions. Good questions on the questionnaire should be direct, clear, and unambiguous. As much as possible, the questions should be unbiased so that the questionnaire may yield useful, unbiased information. To respond to the questionnaires, the questions may be phrased with forced choice or Likert type options. Forced choice options provide few alternatives to answer closed-ended questions. Typically, the options are yes and no. For Likert type questions, there are more options, typically 5 or 7. Apart from question preparation, sampling is important to gather relevant information. That is why pollsters will likely use random sampling so that they can create samples that are representative of the population that they are interested in studying. There are several ways to achieve random samples. First, pollsters may use random digit dialing. This technique uses computers to dial random numbers so as to reach a random selection of homes. The chapter describes how some homes may have multiple phone lines, and so that may increase their odds of receiving one or more calls. Something that the chapter did not mention, but is worth mentioning, is that families these days may also not have phone lines at home. Thus, some families may not be selected to participate in the polls or surveys because of that reason. A second technique is to create computer-generated lists of randomly selected telephone numbers. Such lists will contain more numbers than the target sample size, so as to accommodate calls that do not get answered. Similar to the earlier technique, unlisted numbers do not get to participate in the polls or surveys. That may potentially limit the range of information or views that pollsters can gather. The third technique is fairly common. It is called stratified random sampling. For stratified random sampling, pollsters randomly select respondents from subgroups within an identified demographic category. Pollsters prefer this technique because it guarantees selection of individuals from every subgroup, which can ensure a representative sample drawn from the population. Stratified random sampling has a variation known as cluster sampling. This variation uses computer-generated lists of clusters comprising a number of people. Pollsters will then draw one or a predetermined number of respondents from each cluster to form the random sample. To increase the odds of generating useful and relevant information, political pollsters prefer to have professional callers to conduct the telephone interviews. That is because volunteer callers may bias the results in the candidate's favor. Keeping the telephone interview to no more than 20 minutes and having a human, instead of a computer, conduct the interview will also likely increase the odds of collecting complete interviews. Although information collected from random samples are close to the perceptions of their respective populations, a few factors can confound the results. That means that there are some factors that can cause pollsters to collect unreliable information. Sampling errors are the first factor. It is also fairly common because it can sometimes be difficult to create samples that are representative of the individuals whose opinions are sought. For example, if pollsters want to know how voters will vote, their sample may not be representative if they are not interviewing the voters who will vote in the given election. Thus, the results from such a sample will likely yield inaccurate information. Question framing is another common factor. Questions that are not clear and simple can easily cause confusion and affect the survey's results. Biased questions are one example. Questions are biased when they contain certain words that trigger positive or negative connotations among respondents. Those connotations will steer the direction of how respondents will respond to those questions. Leading questions are another example. Leading questions are phrased in a way to manipulate respondents' response or perceptions and to lead them in a specific attitudinal direction. Another example are the double-barreled questions. Double-barreled questions contain two parts, which may confuse respondents in not knowing which part, or both parts, of the question that they should answer. The third factor is ordering effect, which suggests that the sequence of questions can have an effect on how respondents will respond. And finally, the last factor is the interview effect. The interview effects refer to how respondents respond to the interviewer's behavior. Intercept interviews take place in the public and they offer a few advantages. First, they are a low-cost approach to gather data. Second, it gives the interviewer control over the process because the interviewer can incorporate interactions such as taste tests. The disadvantages of intercept interviews include sampling errors and high non-response rates. More interviews and exit polling are familiar types of intercept interviews that you might have encountered when you went shopping or to vote. Another type of intercept interview that is common is the convenience interview. Convenience interviews take place when the respondents are readily accessible to the researchers. However, convenience interviews have their disadvantages. In particular, the samples created by convenience interviews tend not to be random, which can result in biased findings. Another variation of the intercept interview is the mystery shopper. The mystery shopper is something of a reverse intercept. Instead of selecting a location and interviewing those who approach the location, the mystery shopper visits the store, being tested to see how sales personnel handle their interviews with customers. In that sense, the mystery shopper is essentially an interview evaluator whose job is to assess employee behavior toward customers. Our final consideration of this chapter turns to the ethics of polls and surveys as audience analysis. Many of the major critiques of quantitative research do not attack its methodology, but rather its role in political campaigns and market research. Ryan and Wentworth, 1999, argue that polling has had a negative impact on news coverage of political campaigns, with the media focusing more on who is ahead and who is behind than the substance of political issues. Indeed, the pollster Paul Meslin believes polling has contributed to the rise in negative campaigns. The ethical issue is not whether to use polls, but how to use them in an ethical manner. Polling is merely a sophisticated form of audience analysis, which is a basic skill taught in nearly all communication courses. If audience analysis is important for other forms of communication, then why not for political communication? Thus, it is important to be mindful of how polls and surveys are conducted and how they may affect our decisions, whether it is how we vote or what we purchase.